Well, Betty Sue Flowers, really happy to be interviewing you about your new book for the BMI series and Dialogic OD, Scenarios, Crafting and Using Stories of the Future to Change the Present. Thanks for talking to me.
Thank you. My pleasure.
You have such an interesting background of such a variety of things, and I'm very curious how a professor of poetry first got involved in writing scenarios for corporations.
Well, I think in a way I'd always thought in terms of scenarios because from an early age I realized that what made people think what was going on was not really, if you can even say really, what was going on, but the stories they were telling about what was going on. And I came from a big Southern family and we'd sit around telling stories, my great aunts. If someone didn't tell a story right, even if the story was about what happened to them, someone else would interrupt them and tell the story for them. So the person who told the better story created the reality for the rest of the group, even
Hmm.
though they hadn't been there. So something's very compelling about stories. And so then I got a PhD in English literature, was a professor. And then when I directed the LBJ Presidential Library, I saw what a story of the future, a vision, which is different from a story of reality. It's a story of what you want reality to be, what a vision of the great society could do. And this was uh, this was really interesting to me, as well as at the same time observing how the story of what was going on in Vietnam, which because I'd been to teach-ins as an undergraduate, I knew wasn't exactly based on the history as the Vietnamese saw it. I saw then also what a story could do. So I've been always enmeshed in stories.
Well, I believe that you first got involved in scenario writing for Royal Dutch Shell. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So
Yes.
how did they find you? Or how did you find them? Or how did that happen?
Well, I was series consultant for what turned out to be a very popular PBS series called Joseph Campbell and the Power of Myth.
Yeah.
So you can see this theme already, the power of myth. And the book I did from it became a New York Times #1 bestseller. So people call me out of the blue asking me to edit their books, which I would usually say no to. But one guy called and he wanted to write his book on the American Leadership Forum. And I said yes to him. And in the process of doing our books, that's another long story, he got the job as scenario director, one of the few outside directors they've ever had, for a 3-year stint at Shell. And he said, on condition I can bring my editor, because what he wanted us to do was 9 to 5, I'd be in my office writing scenarios, and then at 5, he'd come in and we'd finish his book, which is indeed what happened.
Hmm.
And then Shell kept asking me back every time they did global scenarios. Every 3 years, I'd go spend, a few months in London writing scenarios. So that's how I got into it.
Okay. And it seems like from there you've become sort of the person that people go to when they want scenarios written. And so is that how you see it? Like how that evolved for you?
Yes, I've worked with a lot of different people. The thing is that one of the biggest issues of our times is climate change.
Mhm.
And the people who know a lot about it are the scientists within energy companies,
Mm.
because the energy companies are facing a very uncertain future. And some of them have invested in renewables, and they know about as much about climate change as anybody I've run across. So, uh, one energy company after another, and the World Energy Council. Uh, I've worked with a lot of different energy companies about the future.
Hmm. Well, if you pick up a textbook in organization development, I've never seen a chapter or even a paragraph on scenarios. It's typically associated with strategy. And
Yes,
so when you first approached me about writing a book for the BMI series, I was curious, like, what motivated you to want to write a book that with a for an audience that's primarily organization development consultants?
because the whole point of scenarios is not scenarios. The whole point is the dialogue that is held. I like to think of it as on top of scenarios, like as if scenarios were a kind of table over which you sat around and said, if this is the future, what should our strategy be? What are the risks? What are the opportunities?
Mhm.
But also, if you're talking about a future, a fiction, a very consciously created fiction, then you can actually argue without fighting, and you can test things out without being so serious that your organizational reputation is at stake. So
Mhm.
I often compare scenarios to the stone in Stone Soup from the fairy tale. You know, the guy knocks on doors and he says, I'm making stone soup. And the people say, What? And he says, Yeah, I've got a stone. It's a great soup. It might be a little better if you'd give me an onion. And the next house, he says, It might be a little better if you gave me a potato. And so by the time he's knocked on the door of everyone in the village, he's got a pretty good soup and he just throws the stone out.
Mhm.
So scenarios function like the stone in stone soup. You talk, talk, talk around them. You talk when you build them. You argue about, well, if this happens, why would that happen? And if that happens, why would this happen?
Mhm.
So that the argument itself, the conversation itself, the many drafts you would go through or might go through in writing the scenario and sending it out to people to read and comment on, that is the real point. In the scenarios, which have to be good, they have to be well written, and they have to be clear, they have to be challenging.
Mhm.
The scenarios themselves are the stone in Stone Soup. They're not the point.
Mhm.
Dialogue is, which
Mhm.
explains the relation between this book and the Institute.
Yeah, that made a lot of sense to me that by offering people a story as opposed to having a conversation about what should we do next, right? It opens up a much more generative space for people to have really important conversations without, like you say, it being a fight. You know, one of the things that I never thought about before that you brought to my awareness, and it's been percolating now for months, is that every leader is operating on a story of the future, whether they're aware of it or not. And
Yes.
yeah, that you can't really make rational decisions unless you've got some sort of ground that you're standing on. And but that ground is always a fiction. Um, I and I'm wondering in your experience, like, well, probably you get called in with people who are more aware of that than others, but I'm wondering if you run into situations where you're dealing with leaders who just aren't aware that they're operating on a fiction.
No one likes to be told they're operating on a fiction. It doesn't sound very, what shall I say, scientific. It doesn't sound very leaderly.
Uh-huh.
But the one of the main problems that happens with companies, and there's some paradigm cases, is that the vision of the future, which is always and only a fiction, becomes the accepted uh, reality. There's something that's almost like an official future that people are unaware they're holding.
Mhm.
It's obvious Kodak was one of the companies that people point to. They had all the technology necessary to create and sell digital cameras, but their story was getting better at what they were already doing. So it's not as if they couldn't have shifted, but that shift was not in their future. And there are a lot of companies like IBM, which was way ahead of anybody in computers, and then but didn't think about personal computers. So business is full of these case studies, and the issue with case studies, when you study them, you say, "Well, I wouldn't make that mistake." The future, I'll look into the future, and sure enough, they look into the future. How's it going to be, and how's it going to be different from the present? And they might come up with a different future, but one different future.
Okay.
And the point about scenarios is they always come in a set of 2 to 4 because you need to think about different possible futures in order to shake up the one story that you tell. It's no good going in and saying, well, your story of the future is probably inadequate. Let's argue over what the real future is going to be, which is a forecast. Scenarios are mutually exclusive worlds. If one comes about, the other one can't.
Mhm.
So building these scenarios that have to be equally plausible in order to be useful, that's the real art. And that's why scenarios, it's always scenarios.
Mhm.
Um, I often when I work with government, um, especially intelligence agencies, um, they say they're doing scenarios, but what they do is they do a projection or forecast, and a lot of businesses do this too. They do a forecast and then they have a little branch point at the end. And then at the end of the conversation, they decide which branch is more likely to be the one that really happens. But real scenario projects don't operate like that. You don't say, where's the branch point and which one's more likely and vote on it and go home. You're always wrestling with different versions of the future.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, it occurred to me like, I think most people, when they think of scenarios and they think of strategic planning exercises and, sort of the whole business sort of thing. But
Yeah.
I was thinking this is just as useful for a leader of, say, an HR leader or for,
Yes.
a head of sales or, to really be able to open up a variety of options and think more strategically about where might we be going and also be able to notice when, the official future isn't happening. And we're starting to veer into something different and be more prepared for it. And have you seen anybody use scenarios in other parts of an organization rather than just for strategic planning?
Yes. Any subgroup can use scenarios. In fact, it can go down to a single individual. I was asked to work on scenarios for the mayor of a major city in South America for his own future.
Hmm.
He wanted to do a scenario process.
Ah,
So it can be any group, uh, whether from a board. I've worked with them on very small boards. The Texas, the state where I'm from, has a sunset law. So commissions, unless they can justify their existence, uh, state government, well, they just disappear. They're sunsetted. So I had one come to me and say, we need to do scenarios that would justify our existence in the future in
hmm.
a lot of different ways. So, a lot of different uses for scenarios.
Yeah, that's what strikes me. And I'm really happy that we're putting this book out into the dialogic community because I think there's real opportunities here to, yeah, this is as a process for opening up a space for certain kinds of conversations to take place that just wouldn't otherwise take place. And I found your book just really it just really helped me understand what that process is, what I need to think about, how I would go about doing that and doing a good job of it. So really happy
Well,
to, yeah.
I've done another book which is a real bridge between the scenarios and dialogue, also from the more of the dialogue point of view. To me, they're left hand, right hand. They're very meshed, and that is a book called Presence, in which there were four authors, Peter Senge, Otto Scharmer, and Joseph Jaworski. And Jaworski was the man that I mentioned before who became the leader of Shell Scenarios for the 3 year stint, who brought me into the scenario world. So there's a big overlap between U theory, scenarios. There's a huge, there's an overlapping, I should say, approach to working in groups between the field of dialogue and the field of scenarios.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think dialogical practitioners would be well aware of that book and of Peter Senke and Anna Sharma's work, and that's why I'm happy that we're publishing this and bringing those two worlds more together, I hope.
I hope so too. That would be an aim for me to have them brought together because as scenarios become more accepted and a lot of governments now have scenario or foresight units in the governments, I want I'd like the business of writing scenarios always to be focused on the dialogue that follows.
Hmm. Okay. Well, thanks very much, Betty.
Thank you.
Betty Sue Flowers does not have a web page and frankly doesn't need one to keep busy. But if you'd like to contact her, try her email, bflowers@utexas.edu.